Hello, and welcome to the IntraCultural podcast. I am Alex,
And I'm Missy.
And I am Lucy.
and we are three anthropologists that lead Willing Observers, a firm of anthropologists fostering inclusion, equity, and change. The IntraCultural podcast covers a range of topics and answers common questions that can be better understood using the concept of culture. The IntraCultural podcast is sponsored by us.
We do a certificate and a certification. So if you're interested in learning more and become more proficient in DEIB, whether that's to help you in your career development or in your current profession, it's a really updated course where we're talking about and applying all the changes of DEI landscape into the program. And essentially, the goal is that by the end, you'll get a certificate or a certification so you can learn how to create more inclusive cultures in your department, organization, university, you name it. And the main difference between the two programs is that one of them is gives you the foundations and the concepts, and the other one, we help you develop your own strategic plan. And there's additional more resources in a toolkit that comes with that. And what else? Let's say anything else I forgot about the programs, Missy?
No, you did a great commercial interlude though. So we don't need it's like we should have introduced it like the Intercultural Podcast, sponsored by ICS. I like it.
And I did not script that. That just came out of my head like that. So maybe I should go into marketing and
There you go.
Well, let's see. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a 50% discount, a permanent discount for anyone that's been unemployed because of the Trump budget cuts. No, because of Trump's anti-DEI executive orders.
Because of Trump's existence. If you are unemployed because of Trump's existence, although that would probably extend further now that we've had tariff week. So
that is totally fine. Come get a 50% discount. We support you no matter what discipline you're in.
well, before we get started, can I ask you both how your day is going?
Yes, you may.
How is
Sorry, there was
your
a
day going?
Chaos. I've been with wonderful children that have drained me of my life force, but it's nice to be around the hope for the future.
I'm doing well. My children, aka my two cats, are asleep. This is the best time when they're not awake. But this morning I woke up super early because Billy, the black cat that usually is around me, he got into his treat bag that was really high on a shelf. And I woke up to all this noise and there were treats all over the floor and the bag was ripped. So now he gets no more treats for the whole week. He used up his whole treat allowance.
He let the intrusive thoughts win.
He did. He's been mad at me because we put a new cat door to go into the litter box area, and he hates cat doors. He wants us to open the actual door for him to walk in. And I think he just did it out of spite, to be honest.
Not because he was hungry?
Oh, he was not hungry. I can guarantee you that.
I mean, to be fair, I love it when people open doors for me too. So
Don't we all?
Totally fair. Totally fair. And I don't understand that motivation, because if I knocked over a bag of treats, I would just eat the treats, you know? It would be treat focused, not revenge focused.
Can it be both? Like, can you feel the sense of revenge and then say, I'm going to eat this treat even though I know I'm not supposed to?
Maybe.
Yeah.
But I mean, in my next life when I'm a cat, I think that'll probably be better.
He's a brat because they're very well trained not to go on the kitchen counters, and the treats were on the highest end of one of the bar counters. So somehow, he's a pretty old cat, 12-year-old cat, he managed to get that high up. So he really felt the need to go for the treats.
Good for Bill.
well, yeah, respect.
Mhm.
Respect.
Yeah.
You're not
100%.
allowed in the house anymore. Bad influences on my cat. They were like coming in, thumbs up, Billy. Good job, Billy.
Well, we're just trying to express some understanding of what Billy is going through because our topic today is a popular topic in DEIB and generally in culture change, and that is cultural humility versus cultural competence. How about that transition, huh?
I
Perfect.
amazed. I had no idea that's what you were going to do, and then I sensed it, and I was very impressed.
Mhm. So, cultural competence, cultural humility. I think probably a good place to start is with maybe some definitions for anyone who is listening that hasn't encountered some of these terms before.
For sure. I think in a lot of the debates, kind of nailing down a succinct definition has been more of a art than a science, I would say. It's a very much an evolving um, kind of concept and theory, but in large competency, cultural competency refers to the ability to do something successfully or efficiently in cultural contexts. It implies having the skills and knowledge necessary to engage effectively with people from different cultures. So a lot of the key aspects of it involve um, understanding cultural norms, values, and as well as the ability to communicate and interact appropriately in diverse settings. But humility differs in that it's more introspective. It's the quality of being humble, having a modest view of one's own importance in a sense. But more than anything, I think it is about um, learning to value the insights and experiences of people from different cultures without assuming superiority.
This happens a lot in the healthcare industry. And it's usually how, when Missy and I have done trainings on the topic, how it has come up in that, one, to your point, cultural competency has evolved so much over time. But the difference in how prior to the evolution it was thought about is that, let's say you're a doctor, like a physician in the United States in a Western context, and you had a patient and you asked the patient, are you taking any medicine? And then they say yes. And you're just like, okay, great. Like, maybe is it like for pain? Okay, yes. So maybe they'll prescribe you something else. But you might not know how they're defining medicine, right? So they might be defining medicine in a very cultural way. Like maybe they're talking about traditional herb medicine, maybe they're talking spiritually in terms of medicine. There's so many different ways that medicine is conceptualized culturally in a Western context versus non-Western context. And so this term of cultural competency became really useful for professionals to think about how you can acquire knowledge about other people and it could make you a better practitioner. Going back to your point, Alex, about efficiency and being effective at doing your job, where the humility aspect comes in based on how I'm listening to the definitions is that you can't then tell the person, well, that's not real medicine. You need to take ibuprofen, right? Then that is where humility comes in terms of being reflexive, having respect for people and how you interact with them, understanding that Western medicine is not always the only medicine or the best medicine for people, and being able to acquire new kinds of relations so that you can do better service. And we're going to continue to unpack that, but that's basically like the kind of two different ways to think about those terms.
Absolutely. And I think, to simplify it even more, I think competency is about, the acquiring skill and knowledge. It's about knowing facts and figures about other people. But, humility is more about the attitude and openness and fostering deeper connections and learning.
So I think, I'll just add on to that. And part of my understanding too is that, like, when you think about competency, it seems like there's an endpoint. So it's like you achieve something, it's an endpoint, you get like a merit badge, right, for it, versus humility, which seems more like a process or something that is continually ongoing rather than something that you acquire having an endpoint. So, for example, right, an acquisition of skill also means that, like, that a culture or a group or understanding has like a top, right? When we think about humility, it's just that you continue learning and you continue growing because we know that, especially with, cultural settings, that we have got lots of different, right, people and ideas, and that things are always changing.
Mhm. And so some of you listening that are really familiar with these conversations might think, well, now cultural humility is part of cultural competence. And it's like, yes, like now the field has evolved to such an extent that anyone that's up to date on the cultural competency things will not teach cultural competence without also adding humility because it's such a big and important part of it. And I have even seen some models that add more skills, right? Like the willingness to be flexible, the willingness to adapt, to grow. Like all of these are additional kind of positions and skill sets that make people more culturally competent. But to your point, Missy, I totally agree. I think there's it kind of insinuates that you can become competent if you just finish this certificate or if you just do this course, then you've acquired all the knowledge you need to acquire. And that's something that we always tell people, like, you're never done learning, right? You're never done growing. And so there isn't an end goal, even if it seems like there should be.
So I think, Missy, you already kind of soft launched the third component of this conversation, which is reflexivity. How do y'all think that figures into the conversation?
You want me to go first? I can go first. So I think that reflexivity is important because, like, part of being reflexive is being, right, able to and willing to continually engage in self-reflection work, into noticing what's happening in the world around you. And so reflexivity is something that is really necessary in order to, right, continue learning and growing, and, right, continue to pivot when you need to, in different contexts and different situations, without thinking about, I have the competence and the understanding of culture A, and so I know this thing. Reflexivity allows you to really, do that reflection work that I think that's necessary. And yeah, I think that's really important.
I have a question. What for the audience? What is the difference between being culturally reflexive versus being introspective, or just being reflexive? Period.
I think the major difference is that being introspective is like continually, it doesn't have the structure necessary for you to do the kind of um, continual reflection work, not only on yourself, right, but like yourself in the world, right? Introspection to me sounds like something that you're like exploring the inner self without thinking about like yourself in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, that's what I thought about too, is that it has to do with recognizing that you have a body. Your body enters in different spaces in different contexts, and people relate to you in different ways because you are in a specific position in the world, and thinking about how that affects your beliefs, your values, your expectations, and how you relate to other people. And that's really the reflexive part. As you mentioned, it's both not just what's going on in your mind, but what's going on when you consider the fact that we're all people and we're all different.
Yeah. And I think, with introspection, it, to your point, Missy, it kind of lacks the interrogation aspect. When I'm introspective, I'm just kind of taking note of feeling, not necessarily questioning and interrogating how those feelings are manifesting, to your point, Lucy, outside of me. And I think that, you know, whether we're talking about relativism, competency, and humility, there is some aspect of questioning and of interrogation and positioning ourselves within broader kind of cultural contexts.
Would you say that you decenter yourself in reflexivity? And what I mean by that is, just comparing it to, let's say, a therapy session. When you're in therapy, you're being introspective. But I also think therapy sessions are very ego driven, right? It's about me, like how I feel, what happened to me, how I relate to others, which is not a bad thing. Like we all need to do that. I love therapy. I go to therapy all the time. Not all the time, every week. But that's different than the cultural reflexivity. And so would you say there's a aspect where you're decentering your ego as part of it, or can it be both?
Well, I mean, maybe the larger question is, can we ever really decenter our ego? But I think that, you know, there's for each cultural reflexivity, competency, and humility, I think the difference is the area of focus. So, to me, I think cultural reflexivity is largely like a theoretical and philosophical kind of belief or practice, and specifically, it's dealing with understanding kind of cultural perspectives and practices. I think that competency is like practical and it's again focused on the skills, while humility is the personal. It is really about how one approaches these kind of different cultural interactions with openness.
Yeah, I like that. And I think if I'm, responding to Lucy's question, I think that a my immediate thought was that where you do decenter the self, it's to understand your part, not just in the world with one other person as an individual, but the other part of this that I don't think we really have, taken a deep dive into yet is the cultural part. And so, it needs to also be it needs to also focus on how you are part of a particular group of people or how you think of yourself as part of a particular group of people in the wider world, and how that manifests or how you think it should manifest, and how that then shapes the way that you think about other people as part of larger groups in the world. And so in that sense, I don't know if that's decentering, but again, for me, I feel like that's like placement, like, or really thinking critically about how you see yourself in those bigger groups, how others see you, and then how that both shapes and is shaped by, right, your perspective on groupness, right? How other people belong to groups or are in groups.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in a sense here, it's about the lens or the framework that you're using to see yourself through. So, a lot of my academic background draws on feminist standpoint theorists. And if, you don't know what that is, it's like they come from a science and technology studies perspective that just says all knowledge comes from somewhere. And that means that everyone has a body, everyone writes from their perspectives. And usually we think of these truth-based with a capital T, or even Western medicine, for example, would be an example of how we think that Western medicine applies universally to everyone all the time. But even the scientific method was produced by white men coming from the Enlightenment era principles and deciding that their way of thinking and seeing the world was universal. And so the positioning is to acknowledge that we all come from somewhere. And to your point, Missing, I think the point you were, I think where I started connecting is not focusing so much on the individual, but the individual as part of a collective. And yep. I think that's the lens that we have to put on. Is it's not just you in isolation. It's not you against the world. Is you are part of a collective, and that shapes your perspectives and your practice and your relationships.
This is actually the second time Lucy and I have had a conversation about standpoint theorists, and personally, I'm unfortunately not that familiar yet. I have a lot of reading to do, and I'm looking forward to it. But Lucy, you brought up a point that has kind of stuck in the back of my head since you brought it up, which is individual versus dividual. Which is, I think the book was Partial Connections. Can you talk a little bit more about that in the relations to, as it relates to this conversation?
Oh my God, you're testing me on knowledge from like my PhD life. So I'll do my best. But one of the reasons why I love that book by Marilyn Strathern, Partial Connections, is because she makes the point that we can never fully detach ourselves from any kind of social relationship, individual. Our knowledge can never fully escape who we are and what we do. We are always connected to other people and each other. So usually, like, let me try to apply it to cultural competence. So usually when we think about, for example, cultural competence, we think and I'll use my example. I'm Mexican American. I grew up with my family, single mom, 4 sisters. My upbringing shaped myself in a particular kind of way. Like, I am loud and I interrupt people all the time. And this is like my cultural disposition, right? And I can think about that as I am an isolated individual that's part of this collective. But Marilyn Strathern says, yeah, but you're always in relation to other people. That means that even if you're still loud and, obnoxious and interrupting people, those practices are going to be shaped by who you're interacting with all the time. So my loudness is shaped by someone thinking that I'm either loud or not thinking I am loud. My how I talk to someone is different in any context or in any setting. So she created this concept, instead of us being individuals, that we are individuals. We're always only partially like in existence. And that means that we're always in partial connections with everyone and everything.
I am smiling because Marilyn Strathern is a Melanesianist.
Yeah, she is.
I did my master's fieldwork in Papua New Guinea, and I can feel everything about relationality that's written about Papua New Guinea. And that's just basically, how people build, right, relationships with one another and how it's primary in, right, certain settings. I can just feel that coming through in the way that you're talking about it. And can I relate, like, from a linguistic perspective, because part of this is about interaction and communication, and there are some other good Melanesianists. I'll name one, Bambi Schieflin, who writes about language socialization. She basically says that learning a first language and becoming a person in a particular society are 2 facets of a single process. So it's when we're thinking about interaction and communication, not only is it about thinking about, right, the individual person and how you're constantly, right, in this kind of relationship with other people in a moment and across time, but that you're socialized into communicating in a particular way as part of becoming a person in a particular place. And that really is part of why, right, cultural humility and competency and reflexivity are central to how we all as humans can, get along and move through the world, because we are shaped and reshaped continually by those kinds of interactions and relationships with other people.
Yes. And I think it always also brings up the point that we are all cultural beings. When we think about cultural competence, so I'll give a story from early on in my DEI adventures, I'll call them that, when I was just learning what DEI profession was. I attended, and this is why I have a lot of examples from healthcare, because that was one of the first places where I heard these terms. But I attended a symposium or some breakfast event, and everyone got a free book on their table. And that free book was about cultural competence and the healthcare profession. And I kid you not, there were tabs. I wish I still had it. I don't know what happened to it. There were tabs for different cultures. So you go to like the Mexican culture, and it would have itemized lists of all the medicinal practices and the spirituality and how the people viewed Western medicine. And you go to the Filipino tab, and then they would have their list. And you go to the Chinese tab, and they would have the list. And that's kind of like the most stereotypical kind of bad way to do cultural competence, right? It assumes that people, one, that they're out there, as if we are not ourselves interpolated through these materials. And two, it that ranks them in unintentionally, maybe, in terms of superiority, right? The goal is Western medicine, and this is how everyone else is not that. And three, that everyone is the same within those tabs, that you just like scroll to your tab and that's you, and then that's it, that there's no blurriness between all of this. And so that's the conversation we're having is we're all changing all the time. We all have these connections with people all the time, and that shapes who we are, to your point, Missy, our personhood, and also highlights how fluid and how porous our boundaries are of who we are.
Yeah. And I think that that's part of like the reflexivity, and why reflexivity, right? And being able to do that kind of reflection work is why I think I could say that all of us here think that that's one of the most crucial elements in like thinking about how we move through the world and take, culture into consideration. And I'll just add on to your point, Lucy. Again, thinking about it through a linguistic kind of perspective, I always tell people when they're learning a language as an adult, to not think about culture as one distinctly tied to nation state, and right, two, as like static, never changing, right? And three, when people do make those claims, who is being represented? So if you go to the airport and you buy a book, they're like, I would like to speak French. And you buy a book, it's like, speak French like a French person. It's like, who is the French person? Who is being represented? And like, the world is so much more fluid and dynamic than that, that like, that's part of reflexivity too, is thinking about the labels themselves when we're thinking about cultural groupings, and like who is being represented as the representative of those groups is also really important for shaping how you move through the world with other people.
I first of all, I'm soaking up all of this because y'all are I think, uh, the experts in ways that I don't think that I am in a sense. But what I've always really been, um, just like drawn to is exactly that notion that culture is dynamic and adaptive, and that it evolves over time in response to changes in the environment, like socialization, technology, all of those different things. And when I encounter people, especially if I were to harken back to my days in advertising, where um, a lot of the times when making a creative ad, people would talk about culture um, in that kind of finite, static way. And to me, that's just so boring, you know. And when you allow yourself to um, embrace the fact that culture changes, I feel like it opens up just like the wonder and the mystery that is, I think, what a lot of us anthropologists have really clung to, is that it changes and there's always more to know and discover.
And
Yeah.
I was going to ask you that exact question, like how does the cultural competence and cultural humility play out in the advertising world? This is, one of the reasons we got so excited to bring Alex on board because we have no idea about that world. And we're like, yes, please, like that is such an important like part where anthropology really can make a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, um, I think the emphasis has been on cultural competency. It is about, I think, just surface level understanding of facts about other people. And, when we look at a lot of the advertising disasters when it comes to how people have been portrayed or just misportrayed, their reliance on things like facts and figures and competency has opens up the door for them to receive just a lot of just pushback. There's like a lot of the famous examples, like I think the um, Kylie Jenner, God, the Coke,
Pepsi.
the Pepsi
Pepsi.
commercial,
Yeah.
Mhm.
like had they understood, um, first of all, especially how dynamic protest culture is in this country, especially in the wake of such a kind of monumental moment, which was the lynching of George Floyd. Then they would have avoided just that PR disaster, because when we understand things from that kind of humble and relativistic perspective, it forces us to be nimble and also to avoid blanket generalizations about people and about movements and about cultures. And a lot of what I've tried to preach, in the advertising world is, and I touched on it just now, is that relativity and humility from cultural perspectives, it's not just more interesting, it's also, the point from which kind of creative innovation is really born. Because those, the process of interrogating one's, position and standing within a society and within culture, um, allows us, like you both said as well, to imagine ourselves as being a part of the rich tapestry of humanity as opposed to apart from. And I think, like, when we lean into the nuances of culture and that kind of, the relativity, so many different weird, wonderful, creative details start to emerge that aren't uh, generalizing, but they're specific and they're precise, and they kind of, touch to the core of what we are as people and what we can be.
I like that Alex said, I'm not an expert. And then he proceeded to school us on like cultural competence, relatively reflexivity, all in one like paragraph.
It was
That was
very, it's
I'm
very,
humble. I'm
very
humble.
humble. It's very meta too. Like, thank you for displaying the thing that we are talking about.
and I love, love, love that you brought up that example because, when I used to do trainings on the topic back when people still remember that ad, it was such a great example of how, one, your perspective is not what everyone's going to agree with. right? Like if you, in that ad, and then just to briefly summarize, and we'll put it in the show notes, but Pepsi put out a commercial where Kylie Jenner took out a Pepsi can and then gave it to the police at a protest for police brutality. Right. That's what we get from the video. And they somehow assume that the vast overwhelming majority of the United States would be completely in agreement with that advertisement. And soon learned that that was not the case, that it had a huge pushback. So what a great example of culture of humility, right? If people were culturally humble, they could have anticipated, like, my perspective is not going to be other people's perspective. So let me get more information on that. And it's not just about acquiring knowledge, to your point, Alex, it's about how do we experiment together. And I love that you brought it home to that point, because in that space of where we don't know about others and we are yet discovering things about ourselves, and Missy and I say this all the time, it's okay to not know.
Right.
It's okay to not know. You figure it out as you go along. And that's the
And you're not supposed to
experimentation.
know everything,
You're not
too.
supposed to know everything. That's a really great point.
Yeah. And I think this is another thing that I think about a lot, both like in terms of how we communicate and how we create, is that it opens doors for something, I think, Alex, that you're very much alluding to, and that's the co-creation, right? So it's not just about like, it does all these great things for like allowing you to be more dynamic, which you need to be in a world full of people who are very different and who have different backgrounds and upbringings and perspectives. But it also allows you to have ownership with other people over the things that you are doing together. And whether that's, working on an ad that isn't terrible, right? Or if that's like having a conversation about what you want for dinner, right? All of those things can be things that you work together with other people to co-create. And I talk about that a lot in terms of even just like our current politics in the United States, that, simply taking a step aside and thinking about humility and reflexivity and co-creation is a really beautiful way to solve a whole bunch of big things in very little ways every day.
I love that point. I think like the co-creation and kind of developing a community of that kind of learning, culturally nuanced thinking, is for sure one of the, I think, um, surest way to at least begin to solve some of the most complex issues that we have. And when I think of things like just competency, the bare bones, like you're just barely trying to understand yourself and other people. Um, to me, that's when people operate solely from a space of cultural competency. I think there's a real fear and of getting it wrong, and kind of saying like, oh, I don't know all the facts about this person, so I'm just gonna not engage. I'm not going to communicate. I am not going to try and bridge divides and build connections with people. But when we are humble and relativistic, you know, it allows us to, I think, recognize our unique cultural perspectives and how our cultural perspectives have shaped our understanding of the world. But it also allows us to center our shared humanity and find the ways that we are um, similar while celebrating each other's differences.
Yeah.
I think we have to throw in an extra term here, which is ethnocentrism, which is,
Oh,
yeah, I know.
yes.
As you were talking, I was like, we need this term too, because when we don't do those things, right, when we're not considering other people's perspectives, considering our own, how our culture shapes ourselves, how it shapes other people, then we risk being ethnocentric. And that just means that you assume that you are the center of humanity, that your perspective can be applied to everyone, and that you can judge other cultures, not in the bounded sense, but all the practices through your own standards. of your own moral standards, your own beliefs, your own values, etc.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I'm going to add that in part because of some of the or many of the things that are happening in the United States right now is that linguistic relativity is something that is important because if you're ethnocentric, then you also think that the way that you speak is the best way or the only way to convey intelligence, to convey ideas. And that is something, right, that is, I think, front and center also at a lot of human problems and a lot of the problems that we see ongoing um, in places that are highly polarized, but in a lot of places in the world.
I think.
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, when I think of ethnocentrism, I think of like resistance to change and evolution. It's just like, wow, you have decided to just stop growing. That's like such an underbaked way to live life in a sense. It's just like, that is the definition of just being static, and that this is how it is, this is how it should always be, and to me, I think like maybe the only comforting thing about ethnocentrism is that while it will always exist in various forms, I tend to think that those are the people who get left behind. You know,
Yeah.
they're not the ones who are contributing to solutions, to creating opportunities by reaching across difference and communicating across difference. And, that's on them.
So,
Yeah.
no, go ahead,
I, I
Lucy.
I think one of the big questions that comes up for a lot of people is, okay, if you're a cultural relativist, does that mean that anything goes, right? Does
I
that mean that you can accept that some people murder babies and that's part of their culture or not?
Oh, I get this in my classes all the time. Alex, do you want to take it first?
You go ahead. You go ahead.
Um, the answer is no, right? Understanding how other people approach the world does not mean that you have to do it the same way, to Alex's point. That'd be boring. Nor do you have to agree with how other people, do things in the world, or like it doesn't erase the idea that you are you and you've been shaped by a certain thing and that you also have like moral positionality. It just means that you have to reflect on that and understand where you're coming from. And you have to understand where other people are coming from. And solving big problems, like, sorry, it's a big problem to be murdering babies, right? But being able to solve those problems means that you have to understand where people are coming from in order to meet them at a place that allows the problem to be solved. Otherwise, you are talking past each other and things will not be solved. That's how I explain it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The other thing that I like to add is that no one is saying you can't judge people. It
Yeah.
just means you should understand them first.
Mm-hmm.
And after you've understood them, and this happens, in relationships, if you break up with someone that you think is generally a nice person, you're like, we just definitely see the world in a different way. That is just how life is. You try to understand each other, you try to make it work. And in the end, you're like, I just think what you're doing is not the way that I choose to live my life. And then what you do after that is up to you. But that doesn't mean you don't judge and you don't have morals and you don't have values. It just means you start from a point of understanding.
absolutely. And I think Missy used the word like, suspending, our your judgment so that we can understand a cultural practice within its specific context. And I think that, that's a really good way to just, especially for anthropologists, is just like just do your job. you know it is like that's where we start to understand, but it's not where we end. you know it is just a frame, a lens through which we can examine the world around us and help people examine their worlds too. And it's I think cultural relativism is just a way of, a mechanism to help folks understand that it's not our job to import our own beliefs into a situation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that our own beliefs are, unimportant or that we should stay neutral. I think it's quite the opposite to your point, Lucy. I think it is just about where are we starting?
Mm-hmm. And I think going back to one of the examples you used earlier too, Lucy, is something that I get, at least some pushback on sometimes. And that's like the idea that the scientific method, right, was created by like a bunch of white dudes, right? Like, does that mean that we outright reject the scientific method and outright reject like the buildup of science? No, that means that when we actually embrace reflexivity and relativism, that we make our science better because we understand the way that certain biases are baked into the existing system. So I think that's an important point too, that like sometimes I call it, God, we're throwing out so many terms, bad postmodernism. It's like, it doesn't mean that like now everybody's perspective is like, is truth, right? Like outright. It means that like we just all have to think about where these are coming from, right? And where these perspectives are coming from. Don't ditch the scientific method, make it better by actually understanding the bias baked into it.
And the other
That's
thing is
that's
accept other ways of knowing as legitimate, right? It's like scientific method is one way of creating truth. There's so many different ways to create truth.
Yeah.
Includes storytelling, right? We create truth through telling stories. We create truths through passing down myths and community lessons. So all of those help us make knowledge too.
absolutely. And I think, like with, your example with like Western medicine and the same with like cultural relativism, there's limits. And I think like um it's important to critically like engage with those limitations and the implications of that, and understand that no, it's not a surefire way to have the most holistic understanding of a culture, but it is again like one of the starts.
It reminds me of my very first undergrad research project. Can I tell you this story? Where I was in Peru testing medicinal plants for bioactivity. And they wanted to legitimize them if they had biological activity on, bioassay petri dishes, that they would conserve and preserve them as part of a museum as actual medicinal plants. And if they didn't, what would happen to them? And so I wrote a whole undergrad thesis breaking down the scientific method and how it was not capable of truly predicting or proving that these plants have medicinal knowledge. That's how I got into grad school. But it really reminds me of this. Like there are limitations, there are things that escape, there's things that are really, can be proven through the scientific method. And there's things that we can't. And that's why we have Ghostbusters and all these other things.
That makes me think
Halloween
of
season.
Stephen Hawking, RIP, I guess, um, who once I think posited that, you know, through various equations, whatever, he proved that, God doesn't exist. And I could just like, I just remember thinking was like, what's the point of making that assertion? And like, it's cool that maybe your equations can prove that, but like, again, why are you going out of your way to disprove other people's ways of navigating this world? And it's such, again, I think like that ethnocentrism and white supremacy that comes into play. And so often when it comes to things like ethnocentrism is that, there's the deciders and the decided upon.
Mhm.
And I think our role as anthropologists, as culture workers, is to make sure that we are not the sole deciders, that we are collaborating with people to decide what the culture is.
Can I give two examples of, I think, that bring a lot of this, like some of this together about like both reflexivity and relativism, humility, and how like it connects with, innovation, creativity. They're two of my favorite examples. One is, since you brought up Stephen Hawking, is Brian Greene's work. So Brian Greene does quantum mechanics and articulates one of the newer but primary theories about like what makes up the universe, and it's string theory. And the entire thing is about how a lot of humans tend to create primacy through the visual world, right? Or even through these mathematical equations. But a lot of string theory is that the universe is built on sound. And so that kind of, work with people that have all of these different kinds of backgrounds and ways of thinking have shifted some of the ways that we think about like our life, the universe, and everything. And one of my other favorite examples is I love Sally Engle Mary, and she writes about international human rights regulations. So we're going all over the place, but I think she's also another person that really thinks about how we have to be relativistic and reflexive when we're thinking about setting things like human rights law, because how are we thinking about standards? How are we thinking about metrics? And how can we look at what other people are doing and truly understand while we're trying to create systems that protect the most marginalized among us? And I will put her work in our show notes because she has a really great little piece about that kind of work that she was doing, being in the room in creating international human rights metrics.
Yeah.
I love how this all became in science and technology studies, like hour. But Thomas Kuhn, Paradigm Shifts, if you get to read about how science develops and how we every so often science changes the way we think about things. And every time we think this is the right way to think about things. And then 30 years later, we'll go back and be like, no, this is actually the right way to think about it. Right. And it really shows you that going back to the ego part, we really are egocentric. And it's our lifelong mission to really challenge that and challenge what we think is true and what we think is universal and what we think is objective.
Yeah.
I know we have to wrap up. Sorry. I want to ask you one more question, which is Missy and I still in our training have used the language of cultural competency, but we've added all of these things into thinking about that. And for years, Missy can attest, I have tried to create a new model or change things up. If you can't see her, she's nodding very violently. So I wanted to ask you both, what is the value of moving away from the cultural competency language and going to cultural reflexivity? This is something we're really thinking about.
I think like, we've touched on it a little bit already, which is one, like cultural competency is boring. It's just like the bare basics, bare minimum that you can do to build understanding, and build connection and kind of reach across difference.
But even if, Alex, even if someone were to tell you, if you add the humility and you add the relativism and you add the reflexivity, is going to make you more culturally competent. Why should we move away from thinking about things in that way? I have some thoughts, but I really want to hear what you all have to say. Like, why should we just not use cultural competency as the umbrella under which all of these other things can fit in?
I think that I'm just not sure what it even means to be competent. In like, how can you quantify or measure, competency in something that is so abstract? And like, to me, it's reifying to, think that it, you know, you can measure skills and knowledge of something that is just so abstract and profound. And I think that when it comes to um, you know, reflexivity and humility, it allows us to kind of exist within that abstract liminal space that is, I think, just so much more thought provoking and interesting and real, and tangible than, dry facts and figures on a, photocopy of a white paper in an office building.
I think I was going to respond with something that is similar in nature, and that is like to the point I made earlier that competency has an endpoint. And I think that if you think that this has an endpoint, then you've missed the point,
Mhm.
because it's about like constantly learning, constantly growing, being able to adapt, being dynamic, and that, decentering competency and recentering something like relativism, reflexivity, and humility, I think actually recenters the point that will get you to the place that people that study or like access cultural competency models are actually trying to get to, which is a functional set of like, tools to allow you to move through a dynamic world in a dynamic way. So that would be my argument for moving away from that as an umbrella term, because I think it misses the point that even the competency models are trying to get you to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the thing that I like the most about centering reflexivity is that then that becomes the beginning and the end, right? Begin with being reflexive, which means that all the other terms immediately fall under it. Like you need humility to be reflexive. You need to be a relativist to be reflexive. You need flexibility. You need adaptability. And then if that is also your goal, then you become all those things at the same time. You become flexible. You become adaptable. You become more competent. You become more efficient. So I like that that as not and it's not even, I don't know, if I were to make a visual of it, it wouldn't even be an umbrella. It would be like the core, right? It's like the core through which you move around in the world, and that all of these other pieces fall into place.
And
Yeah.
can I bring it back to the scientific things? Because like when you started
Yeah.
saying that, I was like, oh, it's like the center of an atom.
Yeah, it is like the center of an atom. All right, we got this. We got to trademark it before the episode goes live.
All right, I think that's a great place to end. So I hope that everybody is going to enjoy the quiz after this of all the terms. No, I'm kidding. But I hope that folks follow up on at least some of these references and readings, because these are. I think we've all thrown out some really, really good things to follow up on if you're interested in these topics. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.